Welcome to another episode of Conspiracy Tapes by Skoob, where we dive into the darkest corners of history that powerful institutions would rather keep buried. I'm your host, Ryan Martin, and today we're exploring one of the most chilling chapters in CIA history, a program so disturbing, so morally bankrupt, that when it finally came to light, it shocked even seasoned intelligence officials. We're talking about MKULTRA, the CIA's decades-long quest to crack the code of human consciousness, to weaponize the mind itself. What you're about to hear isn't science fiction. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's documented fact, pieced together from government documents, Senate hearings, and the testimonies of those who lived through this nightmare. Picture this. It's 1945. World War II has ended, but the Cold War is just beginning. In the shadows of Operation Paperclip, America is secretly importing Nazi scientists, not just rocket engineers, but torturer physicians who had conducted horrific experiments on prisoners at Dachau concentration camp. These weren't just any war criminals. We're talking about people like Nazi Colonel Hubertus Strughold, who would later become known as the father of space medicine, a title that would seem grotesquely ironic to the small children who died in his oxygen deprivation experiments, had any survived to hear it. The newly created Central Intelligence Agency discovered these Nazi experiments with mescaline, attempts to create absolute obedience in victims. Even though these experiments had been complete failures, the CIA's spy masters were fascinated. They eagerly embraced these physicians, arranging for them to continue their twisted work on American soil. When Brigadier General Charles Lukes heard about a new compound called LSD, he tasked his Nazi physicians and chemists to work with the CIA. Their mission: research LSD's potential as both a mass poison and a means of controlling human behavior. This unholy alliance between the Army Chemical Corps and the CIA would birth operations codenamed Bluebird and Artichoke. But the real monster was yet to come. On April 13, 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles signed into existence the agency's most notorious program. Proposed by Richard Helms and managed by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, a man whose resume reads like a horror novel, MKULTRA would become the umbrella project for nearly 2 decades of mind control research. Let me tell you about Sidney Gottlieb for a moment, because understanding this man is crucial to understanding the depths of MKULTRA's depravity. His career highlights include producing deadly pathogens for agency assassinations worldwide, personally carrying a lethal African bacterium to the Congo in 1960 for an attempt on Congolese leader Patrice Lumumba's life. He mailed incapacitant-impregnated handkerchiefs to suspected spies, and when MKULTRA was about to be exposed in 1973, he deliberately shredded the CIA's entire catalog of brainwashing experiments. This was the man leading America's journey into the darkest corners of human experimentation. The program's scope was staggering. MKULTRA would eventually involve more than 80 academic and medical institutions, 44 universities, and 12 hospitals and clinics. The CIA created a network of charitable front organizations with innocent-sounding names: the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, the Geschichter Fund for Medical Research, and the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation. These fronts offered grants and support to researchers across multiple fields. As CIA official David Rhodes explained, "If we picked up a Newsweek one morning and discovered so-and-so was doing something exciting in such and such field, I would get on the phone and say, 'I'm a rep of the Human Ecology Fund, and I'm excited about what you're doing. Can I come by and have lunch with you?' Which at the time was a lot easier than saying, 'I'm from the CIA. The truly insidious part? Most researchers had no idea they were working for the CIA. As an early memo noted, In a great many instances, the work must be conducted by individuals who are not and should not be aware of agency interest. News of LSD first reached the agency in November 1951, when an outside consultant informed an officer that his work with the drug was of great importance to national security. The CIA immediately sought to procure some, purchasing it with untraceable funds through cutouts in Switzerland. The memo that arrived with the first vial read like something from a spy thriller, describing the attached drug as tasteless and odorless, and capable of being easily concealed in any drink, hot or cold. Most ominously, it noted that a heavy dose would comfortably balance on the head of a pin. For the CIA, testing came first, and test they did with a callousness that defies belief. Under Subproject 3, one of 149 subprojects within MKULTRA, the CIA paid George H. White, who worked for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, $40,000 a year to test LSD on random civilians. White established what the CIA called safe houses in Greenwich Village, where he secretly dosed people with LSD. But it gets worse. In San Francisco, White paid prostitutes to secretly dose their customers with LSD while he watched through two-way mirrors. Imagine the scene. Unsuspecting men, thinking they were engaging in a private encounter, instead becoming unwitting subjects in a twisted government experiment, observed like lab rats by federal agents. These weren't isolated incidents. Heroin addicts were enticed into participating in LSD experiments with the promise of their drug of choice as a reward. The CIA also surreptitiously dosed their own officers, claiming they needed to know what might happen if an enemy agent secretly gave LSD to a CIA operative. One can hardly imagine a worse set and setting for a psychedelic experience. Among the unwilling victims of MKULTRA research was Dr. Frank Olson, a bacteriologist working for the CIA on biological and chemical weapons. What happened to Frank Olson in November 1953 remains one of the program's most disturbing mysteries. On November 13, 1953, Olson fell to his death from the 13th floor of the Statler Hotel in New York City. The CIA's official story. A week earlier, Olson's supervisor had secretly dosed him with LSD during a retreat, causing him to suffer a paranoid nervous breakdown that led to suicide. But Olson's family tells a very different story, one that becomes more credible the deeper you dig into MKULTRA's documented horrors. According to his family, during his LSD experience, Olson gained insight that led him not only to refuse continuing his work in germ warfare, but to threaten to expose the entire government program. They believe the CIA murdered him to prevent him from divulging details about the use of biological weapons by the United States in the Korean War. When you consider what we know about the CIA's role in overthrowing governments, assassinating world leaders, and setting up torture sites around the world, when you understand their pattern of conducting unethical experiments on uninformed subjects, the family's explanation becomes disturbingly plausible. What makes this even more chilling? Olson's death, whether suicide or murder, had little discernible effect on the CIA's continuing LSD research. The program rolled on, claiming more victims. By 1963, MKULTRA had grown into a monster that consumed 20% of the Technical Services Division's annual research and development budget, approximately $1 million per year, a substantial sum for that era. The program had expanded far beyond LSD testing. According to a 1963 Inspector General report, MKULTRA had branched out into many additional avenues to the control of human behavior, including radiation, electroshock, various fields of psychology, psychiatry, sociology, and anthropology, graphology, harassment substances, and paramilitary devices and materials. but LSD remained central to their efforts. In Project Darby Hat, the Army interrogated 7 people in the Far East while on LSD. In one particularly disturbing case from 1962, a suspected Asian espionage agent received what amounted to about 2.5 tabs of LSD at 10:35 a.m., was assisted to the interrogation table at 12:20 p.m., and then interrogated until 3:30 a.m. The Army's own trip report, yes, they actually called it that, documented this 17-hour ordeal with clinical detachment. The CIA wasn't limiting their testing to foreign nationals. They were experimenting on American citizens, targeting all social levels, high and low, Native Americans and foreign. Essentially, everyone, with no medical screening, follow-up, or even proper record-keeping. Even within the CIA, some officials recognized the moral abyss they were staring into. In 1963, Inspector General John Ehrman wrote a scathing report about MKULTRA that laid bare the program's ethical and legal problems. Research in the manipulation of human behavior is considered by many authorities in medicine and related fields to be professionally unethical, Ehrman wrote. Therefore, the reputations of professional participants in the MKULTRA program are, on occasion, in jeopardy. But ethical concerns weren't the only problem. As Ehrman noted, some MKULTRA activities raise questions of legality implicit in the original charter. Perhaps most damning was his observation about public disclosure. Public disclosure of some aspects of MKULTRA activity would induce serious adverse reaction in U.S. public opinion, as well as stimulate offensive and defensive action in this field on the part of foreign intelligence services. They knew what they were doing was wrong. They knew it would outrage the American people, and they did it anyway. Ehrman was especially concerned about record-keeping and oversight. He noted that there are just 2 individuals in TSD who have full substantive knowledge of the program, and most of that knowledge is unrecorded. The program was so secretive, so compartmentalized, that its full scope was known by only 2 people. The mind control programs of the 1950s didn't exist in a vacuum. They captured the imagination of the American public through popular culture, most notably in Richard Condon's 1959 novel, The Manchurian Candidate. The book, which was later adapted into a film reportedly favored by President John F. Kennedy, tells the story of an American soldier captured in Korea who was brainwashed into becoming a remote-controlled killer programmed to assassinate a U.S. presidential candidate. What makes this particularly chilling is that Condon's fiction was inspired by very real CIA programs. The artichoke teams that preceded MKULTRA typically consisted of a psychiatrist, a drug expert, a technician, and a hypnotist who sometimes posed as a polygraph operator. These teams were actively working to create the very kind of mind-controlled assassin that Condon imagined. The line between fiction and reality was disturbingly thin. Under MKULTRA, the CIA went beyond mind control experimentation to develop deadly toxins capable of killing without leaving a trace. One such toxin was later used in the CIA mafia plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. For nearly 25 years, MKULTRA operated in complete secrecy. The program might have remained hidden forever if not for the Watergate scandal and the investigative journalism it inspired. On December 22, 1974, the New York Times reported that the CIA had conducted a massive, illegal domestic intelligence operation during the Nixon administration against the anti-war movement and other dissent groups. The revelation sent shockwaves through Washington and led to the creation of 2 congressional committees and a presidential commission to investigate. It was during these investigations that the American people first learned about Project MKULTRA in the summer of 1975. The initial revelations were staggering enough. A program that had operated from 1950 to 1972 involved more than 30 institutions and included tests where LSD and other drugs were used on unwitting subjects with no medical screening, follow-up, or even record-keeping. But that was just the beginning. In spring 1977, more information became public, revealing that actually at least 80 institutions had been involved in the program's activities. On August 3, 1977, Senator Edward M. Kennedy opened Senate hearings on MKULTRA with remarks that captured the full horror of what had been uncovered. Other experiments were equally offensive. For example, heroin addicts were enticed into participating in LSD experiments in order to get a reward, heroin. But Kennedy identified the most disturbing aspect of all. The extent of experimentation on human subjects was unknown. Why? Because the records of all these activities were destroyed in January 1973 at the instruction of then CIA Director Richard Helms. The systematic destruction of MKULTRA records in 1973 represents one of the most egregious cover-ups in American intelligence history. Richard Helms, facing the possibility of congressional investigation, ordered Sidney Gottlieb to destroy virtually all documentation of the program's activities. This wasn't accidental or bureaucratic housekeeping. It was a deliberate attempt to hide evidence of decades of illegal experimentation on unwitting American citizens and foreign nationals. Senator Kennedy understood the significance of this destruction, stating admirably, if futilely, that the best safeguard against abuses in the future is a complete public account of the abuses of the past. But thanks to Helms and Gottlieb, that complete public account would never be possible. When Gottlieb appeared before Frank Church's Senate Intelligence Committee in 1975, he claimed to have forgotten virtually everything he had spent the previous 25 years researching. A laughable performance that fooled no one but left investigators with few alternatives. The destruction of records meant that we know some of what they did, but much of their nefarious activity will forever remain secret. How many people were dosed without their knowledge? How many suffered long-term psychological damage? How many died? We may never know the full extent of MKULTRA's victims. Ironically, one of MKULTRA's most significant impacts was completely unintended. The program introduced thousands of research subjects to LSD, including individuals who would go on to champion the drug's consciousness-expanding properties. Among these unwitting participants was Ken Kesey, who would later write "One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest" and become a central figure in the 1960s counterculture movement. The CIA's attempts to weaponize LSD inadvertently helped spark the very intellectual dissent and anti-war movement they would later try to suppress. This supports the argument made by psychedelic researchers like Terence McKenna, that psychedelics are illegal not because the government wants to protect us from ourselves, but because they catalyze intellectual dissent and independent thinking. The CIA had taken a tool of enlightenment and tried to turn it into an agent of chemical warfare. In a bitter irony, their experiments may have contributed to the social movements that would challenge the very establishment they served. What are we to make of MKULTRA's legacy? How do we process the reality that our government spent decades secretly experimenting on its own citizens, often with devastating consequences? The program reveals the dangerous mindset that can take hold within intelligence agencies when they operate without oversight or accountability. The CIA's original charter was supposed to limit its activities to foreign intelligence gathering, but MKULTRA clearly violated both the agency's charter and U.S. laws. The program's architects justified their actions through appeals to patriotism and national security, watchwords that were used effectively to keep secret what Senator Kennedy called a multitude of sins and questionable activities. But perhaps most disturbing is how long the program remained hidden. As former CIA Director William Colby wrote, "The press, by and large, willingly accorded the CIA a privileged position among government agencies and refrained from inquiring into and reporting on its activities as a self-imposed act of patriotism." This deference to authority, this willingness to trust institutions simply because they claimed to be protecting national security, enabled decades of abuse. MKULTRA officially ended in 1972, but its shadow still lingers. It remains a chilling reminder of what can unfold when secrecy replaces accountability and power operates without scrutiny. The officials behind it believed they were serving a greater cause, yet their choices crossed lines that cost countless unknowing lives. The program failed to produce the control it sought, but the damage it left behind is undeniable. Even now, destroyed records ensure we may never grasp the full extent of what happened, leaving history with questions that refuse to fade. But what if the most disturbing truths were never written down? And what other secrets remain buried beyond the files we've seen? Download the Skoob app now to get access to the full story and uncover the details that go deeper than this episode.